Workers digging up graves, hospitals pushed to the brink. Brazil is now among the worst hit by the CCP virus. What are its ties to China, and how did the communist regime gobble up Brazil's key resources? It's called the Gestapo of China. A notorious Chinese agency tasked with cracking down on dissidents was said to be disbanded 2 years ago, but an internal document shows the agency still actively operates under a different name. An eye-opening experience. A Chinese student studying abroad in the UK for 2 years discovered the truth about the CCP. What he found helped him understand the pandemic. And a grand jury has indicted a Harvard professor for allegedly lying about his ties to China. This is one of the Justice Department's highest-profile cases in its China initiative to counter Chinese espionage. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. During the first week of June, the northeastern Chinese city of Mudanjiang tested its entire population for the virus, around 660,000 people. According to the official results, a mere 19 people tested asymptomatic but showed no symptoms. Unlike other countries, China does not include asymptomatic cases in its virus tally. We spoke to one of the city's residents who says she doesn't believe the official figure. She explained that on one particular day, she heard 180 people had tested positive.
In the early days, I heard that 180 people tested positive in one single day in our city. And there were more than 1,000 people who came into close contact with these people. Their testing results remain unknown. No one dares to pass on this information now.
She says she feels that her city has become a second Wuhan.
When 3 people walk together, they'll be arrested and detained. You're not allowed to stay outside. Since yesterday, everything's been closed except big supermarkets.
One video shows the entrance of one of the city's neighborhoods. Just outside, a large red sign reads, "No taxis and cars allowed from outside." According to the person recording the video, no one from outside the neighborhood is allowed to enter. A different video captured the situation of another neighborhood. The person who filmed the clip says 2 cases of the CCP virus were detected nearby, and that the building of the house of the virus patients has been blocked off. One netizen posed a critical question. If authorities are announcing so few virus cases, why are they strengthening protective measures? A recent study by a chair professor of microbiology at the University of Hong Kong may hold an explanation. The data shows out of 452 people who returned to Hong Kong after visiting Hubei province, 17 of them, or about 4%, tested positive for the virus antibodies. That means they had previously been infected. Based on the 4% infection rate found by the study, over 2 million people may have been infected. But the Chinese regime says only about 70,000 people in Hubei province had been infected. That means around 97% of infected patients may never have been diagnosed. The European Union is cracking down on virus-related misinformation. It has accused Russia and China of running what it called targeted influence operations and disinformation campaigns in the EU, its neighborhood, and globally. The EU since set out a plan to tackle a huge wave of false claims about the pandemic. According to 2 senior EU officials, Facebook, Google, and Twitter should report monthly on how they're fighting fake news. Hundreds of thousands of seafarers have been stranded at sea, some for several months, due to lockdown measures in some countries. Many of them reported physical and mental health issues as a result. The International Labour Organization has now called on governments around the world to allow the sailors to return home. Students from mainland China who choose to study abroad often gain access to resources and information strictly forbidden in China. After seeing uncensored information for the first time, they have a choice to make. Some of them still cling to the Communist Party's propaganda, while others start to question it, embarking on a journey to find the truth. We talked to one of them, Mr. Lee, who's been studying in the UK for 2 years. We gave him a pseudonym to protect his identity. On June 4th of this year, he lit a candle at his home in the UK to remember those killed by the Chinese regime during the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. Mr. Lee told us that when the pandemic hit, he found himself staying home and had more free time to hunt down information online. He said he was shocked by the seriousness of the situation in Wuhan, but his family in China knew nothing about it, and it worried him. He later found an overseas Chinese person on YouTube talking about the pandemic. That person was actually a student leader in China's 1989 democratic movement and was later sentenced by the regime to 10 years in jail. Mr. Lee described what it felt like to see the video of the massacre from 31 years ago.
The bloody scenes were hard for me to accept. We have been deceived. A strong feeling of outrage and sorrow struck me. I've never had such a strong feeling before. It's as if you were told you're not the biological child of your parents. It's an unforgettable feeling of being completely deceived.
Mr. Lee says he has a long journey ahead of him still and still has much to learn. He's also afraid of facing persecution in China. He explained that while reading stories of Chinese human rights lawyers or others who criticized the regime who were killed some 50 years ago, he began to shake with fear. But he says he has great respect for them because they were willing to face death to stand up for their beliefs. Lastly, he explained that while the Wuhan virus made him doubt the Chinese Communist Party, the Tiananmen Square massacre helped him see through it. Tensions are rising between China and the West. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has accused Beijing of coercive bullying tactics. Now he's calling on the UK to choose a side. He says the US stands ready to assist the UK with any needs they have, including building nuclear power plants and developing 5G technology. Under pressure from Beijing, British bank HSBC recently signed a petition supporting Beijing's plan to impose a so-called national security law on Hong Kong. The new law would effectively end Hong Kong's autonomy. Pompeo called HSBC's corporate kowtows received little in return from the Chinese Communist Party. Similarly, NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg warns that China is multiplying the threats to open societies and individual freedoms. He also says the pandemic magnified existing tensions and trends to their security. He's now urging more countries to stand up to the regime's bullying and coercion. But when asked, he denied that China was now NATO's enemy. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a military alliance of North American and European countries set up during the Cold War to fight against the Soviet Union. According to a Japanese media outlet, Huawei is inviting its microchip and printed circuit board suppliers to set up plants in China. So far, they haven't responded. The impact of the CCP virus and the U.S. sanctions imposed on Huawei are thought to be the main reasons for suppliers' hesitation. And an update on Beijing's new Hong Kong law, Japan says it hopes to take the lead on a G7 statement based on China's one country, two systems framework. China has since issued a protest. The US, UK, Canada, and Australia had already signed a similar joint statement before. The president of the Czech Republic Senate has announced an upcoming visit to Taiwan. Taiwan has a democratic system, despite China's claim of Taiwan as one of its provinces. The Czech senator's move angered the CCP. According to a Chinese state-run media outlet, China plans to retaliate against the senator. Soon after, thousands of people took to the streets in Prague, the Czech Republic's capital, to protest against the country's ties to the CCP and support the Senate president's visit to Taiwan. The CCP claims the right to speak on behalf of minority groups and thus has power over them. It then uses that power to interfere in foreign affairs. An in-depth report by an analyst at the International Cyber Policy Center maps out the structures and method of the Chinese regime's global foreign interference machine. It details how the party uses the United Front Work Department to suppress criticism, interfere in foreign politics and education, and separate communities. The report draws on government documents, media websites, and online posts and photos from platforms and social media outlets like WeChat. United Front members have been accused of interfering in Australian politics, stealing tech from the U.S., and suppressing academic freedom on campuses through Confucius Institutes and their members. The United Front's reach has also surfaced amid the pandemic. Groups in the U.S., the U.K., Australia, Canada, Argentina, Japan, and the Czech Republic were able to rapidly gather medical supplies and send them to China. This despite those countries having a scarce amount of medical supplies themselves. According to a 2015 meeting for the United Front, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said the United Front is an important magic weapon for strengthening the party's ruling position and an important magic weapon for realizing the China dream. According to the department's director, the United Front is a political alliance and the work is political work. The United Front Work Department has been an official part of the CCP since 1979. While the Chinese regime claims the work it carries out is democratic, its own documents show it has a wide propaganda reach. It controls China News Service, one of the largest media networks in China, which also has several overseas bureaus. So what kind of work falls under the United Front? It covers everything from espionage to foreign interference, as well as influence. According to the author, the work is constantly evolving to reflect the CCP's global ambitions. His research found the group ties all the way back to the highest level of the regime and has several tiers and a massive reach around the globe, which poses threats to other countries. He recommends governments take steps to recognize the issue at hand, raise awareness of the risks posed by the United Front work in foreign interference, work with universities to develop responses, and then have laws in place for transparency and to hold foreign agents accountable. That means denying visas or expelling people who engage in foreign interference. With infections hitting a record high, Brazil is now one of the world's top hotspots for the CCP virus. As of today, Brazil has over 700,000 confirmed cases and nearly 40,000 deaths. The country's health system is on the brink of collapse, and workers had to dig large-scale graves to keep up with burial demands. Countries hit hardest by the virus appear to share one common thread: close ties with the Chinese Communist regime. It's the same with Brazil. As South America's largest nation, Brazil's economy is highly reliant on exports. China has been its largest trading partner and export market for the past decade. Over a quarter of Brazil's exports go to China, while the United States, in second place, gets only 12%. Economic dependence on China comes with a flip side. This March, President Bolsonaro's son enraged Beijing with a single tweet. Eduardo Bolsonaro, a lawmaker, criticized the Chinese Communist regime for concealing the scale of the virus outbreak. He tweeted, "It's China's fault and freedom is the solution." The Chinese embassy responded that the president's son contracted a mental virus. The embassy added, "We would advise you not to be in such a hurry to be the U.S.'s spokesperson in Brazil. You'll fall flat on your face." A Chinese consulate general also published an op-ed in the nation's major newspaper. He threatened, "Should any country insist on being China's enemy, we will be its most sophisticated enemy." Many Brazilian authorities criticize Eduardo Bolsonaro for endangering relationships with China. They also contact the Chinese embassy to apologize. This includes the head of Brazil's Senate. He apologized in the name of Brazilian parliament and praised China, saying its crisis management set an example to the world. A day before the apology, he tested positive for the CCP virus. A week after the diplomatic spat, Brazil's largest city, Sao Paulo, had a strange incident. Residents in over 70 neighborhoods of the city and its metropolitan region reported a water shortage and decrease in flow. This couldn't come at a worse time when proper hygiene is needed for lowering virus infection. Residents suspected water rationing, but authorities denied it. They also said there's no shortage of state water resources. One of the region's water suppliers was acquired by a Chinese construction company 2 years ago. After the takeover, China state media reports the water supply system will serve 1.5 million people in Sao Paulo and help ease the water shortage in the region. The company delivers water to Sao Paulo's metropolitan region and is interconnected with other systems that supply greater Sao Paulo. It's unclear if the water shortage was related to the diplomatic incident. Authorities didn't give reasons for the water shortage. Aside from the water supply company, China owns other key assets in Brazil. In 2017, China State Grid bought one of Brazil's largest power distributors, CPFL. This company provides electricity to 10 million customers. China's investment came at a time when the Brazilian government was in need of quick money. Around 2017, bugged by budget deficits and eager to raise money, the previous administration planned to privatize and sell off state assets, from the national mint, airports, and highways to the country's largest power company. China's shopping spree also raised concerns. President Bolsonaro warned before that the Chinese are not buying in Brazil, they are buying Brazil. He has repeatedly criticized Chinese investment as a threat to national security and economic sovereignty. In 2016, China took over two of the largest hydroelectric dams in Brazil. With the deal, the Chinese company became one of the biggest power producers in the country. China also bought control of one of Brazil's most profitable container terminals, its second busiest international airport, and a third of its niobium. The shiny white metal is highly sought after. Niobium is widely used in jet engines that power military aircraft. A Brazilian company, CBMM, produces 80% of the world's niobium supply, and China owns 15% of the company. Not everyone is happy with the buyer's growing influence in the tropical country. 2 months after the Twitter spat, the Chinese embassy sent a letter to Brazil's parliament members, asking them to not congratulate Taiwan's president on her inauguration. Beijing considers Taiwan a part of its own territory, while Taiwan says it doesn't accept rule under the communist regime. A Congress member leaked the letter on Twitter and congratulated Taiwan's president. The tweet sparked a trending hashtag, Viva Taiwan, meaning long live Taiwan. Many Brazilians followed suit. One netizen said, "To congratulate or not is a decision of Brazil. Who do you think you are to instruct them to follow your orders, CCP?" It's been called the Gestapo of China. The 610 office is one of the Chinese regime's most notorious agencies, tasked with cracking down on dissidents and religious minorities. It was supposedly disbanded 2 years ago, but internal documents indicate its functions are still actively carried out in China, only under a different name. The Chinese regime established the 610 office on June 10, 1999, 21 years ago. A Chinese human rights lawyer has compared it to Hitler's Gestapo. Although it's little known outside China, it is extremely powerful. The Chinese regime set up this extra-legal organization in 1999 to persecute the spiritual practice Falun Gong. It later expanded to also targeting people who believed in other so-called unapproved spiritual practices, like house church Christians and Buddhists, as well as human rights lawyers. The 610 office operates at every level of Chinese society. It reported directly to the top Chinese Communist Party leader at the time, Jiang Zemin. On the surface, the CCP says this organization no longer exists. Current communist leader Xi Jinping gradually weakened and eventually disbanded the office through structural reforms after he took power in 2012. But an internal document recently obtained by NTD's sister media, the Epoch Times, presents a different reality. The 610 office may have just changed the name due to pressure from international human rights groups, and may be operating under a different group called the Anti-Heretical Religion Guidance Branch. Beijing's Fangshan district issued a report from the agency in 2019. It shows the agency giving scores on how well 93 different Communist Party and government institutions are implementing the CCP's anti-religious policies, things like whether they successfully prevented religious gatherings, or if they have successfully transformed and educated religious believers to renounce their faith. The agencies being assessed range across all sectors of the government, from the powerful Political and Legal Affairs Commission, PLAC, to the Organization Department, which is in charge of assigning officials posts and promotions, to local police bureaus, local prosecutors' offices, and courts, among others. Some seem completely unrelated to religious affairs, like the local tax bureau, the meteorological administration, the earthquake administration, the Red Cross, and the urban greening bureau. The report shows none of these agencies escapes the scrutiny of the de facto 610 office. The Urban Greening Bureau, for example, was scored down for not having enough people taking a so-called anti-cult quiz. The quiz asks people what to do when they spot a religious gathering, and the right answer is to report it to the Chinese police. Another document from 2018 shows the agency is even involved in foreign affairs. At that time, the Fangshan District 610 office paid for Communist Party officials to visit Canada. They carried out a campaign against heretical religions in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. The so-called overseas struggle activities in Canada focused on promoting hatred of Falun Gong. The Communist Agency held symposiums and paid local Chinese language media to run propaganda against the practice. For instance, 610 office members teamed up with a Beijing-linked China press to run anti-Falun Gong content every week and produce 400,000 propaganda leaflets. According to Minghui.org, a website that documents the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong, over 4,000 Falun Gong adherents in China have been killed due to the persecution. In the first quarter of 2020, 17 Falun Gong practitioners lost their lives for refusing to denounce their faith. New findings from the State Department today as part of its annual report on international religious freedom. It follows President Trump's executive order last week to prioritize religious freedom in foreign aid programs.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Wednesday unveiling the Office of International Religious Freedom's latest report to Congress. Ambassador of the alliance said repression of faith is unfortunately still too common.
In many places of the world, individuals have become more familiar with religious oppression than religious freedom.
In the worst cases, people are persecuted for their faith and forced to abandon their beliefs or face government backlash.
China continues its decades-long war on faith.
The report reveals last year the Chinese Communist Party regime arrested and detained more than 6,000 people who practice Falun Gong, a meditation discipline that focuses on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. The regime banned the practice in 1999 and continues even now to harass and detain Falun Gong practitioners and people of other faiths.
The Chinese Communist Party is now ordering religious organizations to obey CCP leadership and infuse communist dogma into their teachings and practice of their faith. The mass detentions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang continues. So does the repression of Tibetans and Buddhists and Falun Gong and Christians.
There are reports that the regime forcibly harvests organs from these prisoners of conscience while they're detained. Another focus of Pompeo and his team is freeing 6 American oil executives who have been detained in Venezuela for 2.5 years without trial. As for the Western Hemisphere, Pompeo says the U.S. is working to end forced labor of over 10,000 Cuban healthcare workers, among other initiatives. Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
A bipartisan Senate report asks Congress to clamp down on 3 Chinese telecom carriers. The report describes how these companies got a foothold in the U.S. telecommunications industry and how they undermine the safety of American communications.
A new bipartisan Senate subcommittee report says Congress should move quickly to strengthen the government's ability to oversee major Chinese telecommunications companies operating in the U.S. The report, called Threats to U.S. Networks, focuses on carriers owned by the Chinese Communist regime. It states that 3 Chinese state-owned carriers in operation in the U.S. for nearly 2 decades have only recently been scrutinized by various security agencies. The 3 are China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom. The team behind the report is led by Senator Rob Portman, while Senator Tom Carper is the ranking minority member. Portman said in a statement that the Chinese Communist Party had exploited U.S. telecom's networks, and Carper said more has to be done to protect national security against spies and hackers. The report recommends greater transparency and reciprocity, such as for Congress to require a regular review of Chinese telecom activities with the results to be reported to the legislative branch. It also recommended that Congress require China to grant fair access to its domestic markets for U.S. telecom companies.
A grand jury indicted one of the country's top chemists yesterday for making false statements. The Harvard professor allegedly lied about receiving money from the Chinese regime and for his involvement in China's 1,000 Talents program.
On Tuesday, a federal grand jury indicted Harvard professor Charles Lieber for making false statements to federal authorities. Lieber is charged with lying about his involvement in China's Thousand Talents program. Lieber has denied the accusations. According to the Justice Department, the Chinese regime uses the program to lure foreign experts to bring their knowledge and experience to China and rewards them for stealing intellectual property. The court documents say Lieber specializes in research on nanoscience, and he has received over $15 million in grants from the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. But to get those grants, one has to be open about any other sources of funding, conflicts of interest, and foreign collaboration. The charging documents allege that without Harvard's knowledge, Lieber became a strategic scientist at the Wuhan University of Technology in China in 2011. The court alleges Lieber entered into a contract with China's Thousand Talents program at least from 2012 to 2015. In the contract, the Chinese university allegedly paid Lieber $50,000 a month. It paid him $1.5 million to establish a research lab in Wuhan. In 2018 and 2019, the Harvard professor allegedly lied about his involvement in the program. The charge of making false statements carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a fine of $250,000. Lieber is set to be arraigned at a later date.
In France, construction workers are returning to Notre Dame after weeks of lockdown. Preparing for restoration is a delicate undertaking, a year since a fire gutted the cathedral. Our France correspondent David Vives has the story.
After delays in restoration, workers started removing the twisted scaffolding around Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral.
The work of human hands is absolutely decisive for those on the ropes, who clamber all over the structure with all the agility they have. They're on ropes at 40 meters high.
It's a crucial first step before the cathedral's restoration can begin.
This scaffolding was installed prior to the blaze for restoration work on the Arrow of Notre Dame. But after the blaze last year, it became a constant threat because it could have collapsed on the cathedral at any time.
The damaged scaffolding has been surrounded by yet more scaffolding, and an enormous crane was brought in. The operation will cut away 200 tons of metal, and debris from the roof still needs to be cleaned up. It's precision work, but some parts of the cathedral might not be stable.
And as everyone knows, if one stone falls from a part of the vault, the entire vault could be weakened.
Only after this step, which should last 3 to 4 months, will there be a plan for restoration, and maybe even redesign. President Emmanuel Macron is pledging the cathedral will be fully restored within 5 years. Reporting by David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
According to the UN, a huge amount of North Korea's population is in need of humanitarian aid. The country is currently experiencing a worsening of widespread food shortages.
According to a UN human rights expert, North Korea is suffering widespread food shortages and malnutrition. While North Korea has a history of food shortages, the situation is even worse now, thanks to a nearly 5-month border closure with China and strict quarantine measures. According to the UN, medicine prices are skyrocketing, and some people have only corn to eat while others are starving. In the mid-90s, a famine killed around 3 million people in the isolated country. As of now, over 10 million people, almost 40% of the population, suffer from food insecurity and are in urgent need of food assistance. Due to the shortage of suitable agricultural land, North Korea always faces a challenge in growing enough staple food to feed its population. It's a crucial time for rice growers, who are currently moving young rice seedlings from the crowded beds where they were planted to the big fields. So far, farmers have seen less than ideal weather. And there are other problems to tackle at the moment. The UN urged North Korea to free prisoners during the pandemic because people in their prisons are dying as a result of contagious diseases, overcrowding, and hard work with the lack of food. The true state of the CCP virus situation in the country is uncertain, as North Korea refuses to report its case numbers to the WHO.
In the latest partnership between big tech and Wall Street, Amazon and Goldman Sachs are joining forces to offer small businesses loans. Here's more in today's Business Briefs.
CNBC reports Amazon is teaming up with Goldman Sachs to offer credit lines to some of its sellers. The loan can be drawn and paid like a regular credit card. The amount is up to $1 million, and the annual interest rate is between 6.99% and 20.99%. This is also part of Goldman's push into Main Street finance. Starbucks says it expects its current quarter revenue to plunge by $3 billion. It's also forecasting sales will decline for the rest of the year. The world's largest coffee chain says it will close about 400 of its U.S. stores for good over the next 18 months and cut half of its planned new store openings. The leader of a European bank told Bloomberg it'd be wrong to expect remote working to last after the crisis, since people need to work with people. A recent U.S. survey says half of the workers telecommuting due to the virus crisis are experiencing burnout. AMC Theaters, the world's largest theater operator, plans to reopen most of its theaters globally by mid-July, while limiting audience sizes for social distancing. The theater chain has lost over $2 billion in the second quarter. The question remains whether moviegoers will feel safe returning to theaters.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the latest updates, and see you tomorrow.